the assistant to the town manager, and I'm joined remotely by Marcia Calloway, Mary Leanne, Rob Gear, and Claudette Brochu. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. I have one request that I would like to make, which is I propose that we pull the fund balance reserve policy. The latest copy of the policy was not in the packet. And I think we could benefit from having less robust of an agenda now that I look at it more closely. Okay, I see a hand. So if I happily take a motion with that amendment. Go ahead, Claudette. Excellent, thank you. Made by Claudette, and I saw Mary's hand for a second. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, great, unanimous, thank you. Are there any public comments for items that are not on the agenda? That's next. Okay, and just as a reminder for folks, if you're on Zoom, if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's an option to raise your hand. Okay, not seeing any. Is there any select board comments? Okay, great. We'll move on then. The next item on the agenda is the consent agenda. When we approve the consent agenda, we are receiving correspondence, we are approving the AP warrants, and we are approving draft meeting minutes for 10/13. Anything that requires substantial discussion, we typically pull to receive separately. Go ahead, Marcia. You're on mute. Okay. Okay. Anybody else would like to pull anything? Okay, so so in that case, why don't we, Cheryl, I see your hand also. So why don't we make a motion to approve the consent agenda and while pulling the one letter of correspondence, and then we'll have a discussion about that. Does that make sense procedurally? Miranda's nodding, so. So moved. Okay. Is there a second? But okay, made by Mary, seconded by Marcia. Okay. So now, any discussion of the consent agenda absent that one letter of correspondence? Okay, Cheryl, would you like to make? Yes, I now see your physical hand. Would you like to make a comment? Go ahead. So Nathan, Mark, go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt. I'm happy to provide an answer. Oh, okay. Yes. Sure. So Nathan Margolis was appointed to the finance committee, and then he was even available later in the meeting, and he sort of spoke to us about it. So I'm do board members notice that the meeting minutes are unclear of that fact or don't reflect that? We're looking now here. There was a motion made and we voted, it was 4-1. Yes, so thank you, Marcia, it was 4-0-1, right?
Yeah.
And it's reflected there.
Yep.
Marcia, so.
Top of page 2.
Page 2, yeah?
Yeah.
No, it's okay, thank you. So any other discussion on the consent agenda right now? Okay. I see that Mary stepped away just a little bit. There she is. Okay, sorry. All in favor of approving the consent agenda, please raise your hand. Mary, I can't see your hand. I think you froze, so I'm gonna wait a little second. There you go, now I see it. Excellent. I think that was unanimous. Okay. Now, why don't we begin with a motion to receive the correspondence and then we'll discuss it. So go ahead. Yes, the Jenny Barba correspondence. Yes. Great. Is there a second? Okay, great. Marcia and Mary. Okay. What would you like to discuss about this correspondence, Marcia? Yes. Yeah. Well, do any board members have any other comments on that? Go ahead, Mary. Okay. Yeah, and the only thing I'll say is I think Marcia's suggestion that, or recognition rather, that there's some other interrelated conversations in our RFP on public safety is due back to us on the 15th. So I think it will indeed become a future agenda item. Great, no, thank you. So all in favor of receiving this correspondence, please raise your hand. Okay, great, thank you for that. All right, the appointments to the town manager screening committee. And so I'm actually seeing some folks who had applied and spoke with us last week here with us, which is not necessary, but is really wonderful and appreciated. So what I will say to this is we had agreed to a process where we would hear 11 of our applicants for 2 of our spots for the screening committee, and we would all sort of go back and choose 3 because there were some rules of math where we would see some natural overlap, and then from there we could begin to discuss some of that overlap. Claudette and Mary had made their selections and their process clear in a memo that we've benefited from in the packet. Rob had sent me some of his names, and then and I think that's really helpful to have come into this meeting prepared in that way. The only other thing I want to say before we then begin to sort of name names, so to speak, is Mary's memo pointed out that that there may not necessarily be a formal committee for the sort of the second process. That was the interviews of 2 to 3 candidates. She went back and read the proposal from VLCT and didn't necessarily read it in that spirit. I appreciate Mary's attention to that. And so similarly, Claudette, you know, went as far as to suggest some names for that second committee, because we also had a conversation for that this pool would be good to draw from. The only thing I will say to that is whether it's a formal committee or not in the next one, we could, I think it's certainly appropriate to request to our recruiter that we would have additional 2 names to be a part of that conversation from this pool, and we can decide on these names this evening, as Claudette has suggested, or we could wait to a future meeting. So these are some of the 2 process things I wanted to bring forward, and then otherwise we can discuss. Any questions or clarifications about my my sort of process notes? Go ahead, Marcia. Yeah. Claudia, did you have thoughts? Because you sort of advanced this further to say that you were willing to make suggestions for the future work, or your memos speaks for it. Do you have anything to add to Marcia's point about we're making the screening appointments this evening, but there was this question of whether or not we wanted to consider the sort of the future iteration or not, and you had said that we should move forward with that. Any other thoughts other than what you've expressed in your amendment? No? Sorry.
Did she hear you?
People hear me?
Doesn't look like it.
Well, that's good. Okay. Oh, so okay, so let's begin. So I noticed a couple. Go ahead, Rob. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah. Well, I would just agree that we should make up our mind tonight, because I personally am not convinced that the first and a possible future committee need to be different people entirely. That's it.
Okay. So, all right, thank you, Rob. So let's begin. Let's make a screening committee, and let's just begin very simply. Sorry, I'm like eating a banana. So let's just begin by naming the 3 selections that you had made. Just name the names, and we'll see if there's overlap, and then we'll discuss. Maybe there'll be some easy choices. So Mary, why don't you begin and remind us of the 3 that you selected? I think you froze, Mary.
Am I unfrozen?
Yeah.
I do.
Or should I put it in the chat?
No, I think.
Oh, go ahead.
If you turn off your camera for a little bit, and
Right.
just talk to us and see how that works. So can you?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'd actually be happy to work with anyone who came forward. I think everybody has a lot to offer this process, but my top 3 picks are Matt Sweat, Demos Sophronius, and Richard Stucker.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Rob, can you name me your 3 names?
Sure. My top 3 picks, ranked according to my own qualifications, were Marissa Lorenzo Richard Stucker and Liz Bloom.
Okay, Claudette, remind us of your 3.
Mine were Richard, either Marissa or Emily, and Pam Smith.
Okay. And then Marcia.
Nathan Margolis, Demo Sophronis, Marissa Lorenzo.
Okay. And then I was Matt Sweat, Liz Blum, and then I was similarly very torn between Emily and Marissa. Okay, so let me look at this, right? So,
I made a grid.
oh, excellent. So, what, do you want to share your grid? Did you just make this now?
I'm just going through right now.
Yeah, so I wrote it as well. So there's definitely some overlap, right? Which is good, so we can begin to make some decisions. So what I might do, if that's all right with folks, is names that were uniquely named, right? That were only named once. And then, of course, I echo what Mary was saying. Like, you know, this is everyone was so qualified, and this was, and we were so appreciative to receive these applications, right? But nonetheless, we do need to just make some decisions. So, if I eliminate people that were named once, I would eliminate Nathan and then Pam Smith, right? And then everybody else seemed to be named again.
Uh-huh.
Marsha?
Yeah, I think I've got, 1 second. Okay, I think we have 3 for Stucker, 1 for Emily, 1 for Pam, 1 for Nathan, 2, no. Mary, can you give me yours one more time?
Mary was Matt, Emo, and Richard.
Stucker, who,
Stucker,
do it one more time?
no.
The third one?
Demo Sopranos.
Okay. Demo had 2, Marissa had 2, Matt had 1. No, he had 2. And I believe Liz Bloom had 2.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yep, that sounds right.
So I will say that Emily and Marissa, Claudia, and I were similarly positioned, so we could Emily and Marissa would have probably 2 if we were either or. So we're in a situation. So I would say I would recommend that based on this, that the board may wish to appoint Richard Stucker because he has 3.
Yep.
So it
Marsha,
looks
you
like
still-
we've got, yeah, I'm here. It looks like we've got 4 people with 2 votes.
Right, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. So we'll have to make some decisions for the last spot. So I see Emily Shear has her hand. Go ahead, Emily. Would you like to make a comment?
Well, I noticed that I'm sort of like either or with Marissa. I fully endorse Marissa. So I won't be, I think she would be great. So if we sort of are either or, I'll be happy if she's appointed. If that makes things easier.
That's very kind. It's very kind, Emily. Thank you for your feedback on that. Go ahead, Claudette. You had your hand up.
Yeah, so I would move that we appoint Richard Stucker and Marissa Lorenzo to the screening committee.
I'll actually second that.
Okay, I think Rob Rob was his.
Rob got it?
frozen,
Okay.
Yep.
So made by Claudette, seconded by Rob. Any discussion? The only thing I will say is I thought that Matt Sweat would be really would have a really unique point of view to offer as someone who is works really closely with town staff and then is also a resident, and all of my interactions with him have been incredibly kind and thoughtful, and so that was one person that I had named and is not being nominated. But go ahead, Claudette.
Well, I agree with you, which is why I had placed Matt in the second grouping. But like everybody else said, I could go with,
Yeah.
Everybody is qualified. You just have to make a decision. So.
And I would love to take, all the time to like lift each of these individuals up, right, and speak to all of their qualifications. But we do have a packed agenda, and so with that, if there's no further discussion, I should call the question. Is that what we should do?
Sounds good.
Okay, all in favor of the motion, which would have Richard Stucker and Marissa Lorenzo to the screening committee, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you, unanimous. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for everyone's participation. We're so lucky. Okay, why don't we move on to the interim town manager report?
Good evening, everybody. This is Rod.
Move that owl.
And I'm just waiting for that owl to find me. Sorry.
It's okay.
It's okay. There you go. It's a fairly brief outline in terms of the town manager's report. I have some more recent human resource updates. So we're very sad to learn, on one level at least, sad that Masaki Shuet will be moving on from her position at the Department of Public Works. She has been able to secure a position in her career field and is looking forward to full-time employment. We thank her for her service and her good cheer and her diligence, so she'll be sadly missed. So that's one down, but we're also one up. I was able to make an offer for a candidate who applied for the heavy equipment operator position at Public Works. And we are in the final throes of confirming that offer, and we look forward to them starting within a couple of weeks. We have the Public Works director position out there advertised. We don't have any responses yet, but we're hopeful that that we'll get some good candidates for that. That's DPW staffing updates. The CCI project of continually upgrading our IT is going well. We're still having spasmodic issues with having ancient machines connect to ancient printers, which they're being diligent and conscientious about resolving, but we're looking forward to new equipment that hopefully will begin to reduce the number of calls that we are putting into them. And I expect that the new server will be located here and up and operational by the middle of December. We have financials for September to discuss later on in the meeting, and so I'll push that off until then, and the same with the budget. So I don't think I have anything else dramatic to report, but I'm happy to take questions if people have them.
Do folks have any questions about Rod's report or anything else? Go ahead, Mary.
Is there,
May I think you should try, did you turn your camera off?
try it again.
Make your
Sorry.
comment, and maybe try leaving and coming back after that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Just wondering, since Masaki is moving on, there's a bit of,
Mary?
yes? Can you hear me?
Yes. Now.
Now what?
Now we can hear you, sorry.
Okay. All right, I'm glad you can hear.
Okay, now we can't hear you. So Mary, why don't you try leaving and come back, and then I'm going
You're saying I should re-enter the meeting.
to re-enter the meeting, yes.
Okay, yes, I'll do that.
Okay, so if I think what Mary might have been saying is now that we don't have the benefit of having Masaki at DPW, what is the interim plan to meet to fulfill the role that she has?
We propose to advertise the position as a part-time position, so half-time as Masaki was doing it. And we've reviewed the job description and we hope to have an advertisement out by the end of this week. We are suitably skeptical about our chances of finding a person for that position easily, given that those skills are in huge demand everywhere, and that it'll be very difficult, we think, to find. We won't be able to replace Masaki. Let's just be very clear. But we think we are going to have challenges finding a suitable candidate for that position.
All right. How's this? Not working?
It's working, yes. So the question I just asked is, what is the plan now that sort of Masaki is not with us right now that she's
Okay, sorry. I just wondered whether it's a DPW, but it just seems like they're.
We lost you, Mary.
There's a large gap there, so I don't know if it's on Rod.
There was definitely a large gap between the sentences you were trying to put together because we lost you. Go ahead, Claudette.
I'm wondering, even though I'm loath to increase our salary lines, but there is a proposal that you had presented, Rod, in making that a full-time position. Do you think the position would be more attractive and may attract more candidates were it posted as a full-time with benefits?
I've been giving that quite a bit of thought since Masaki gave us a resignation. I think in the short term, I'd probably like to start the person part-time, and if it worked out and was successful, then I think we should contemplate making it a full-time position. You know, I think the best approach here as the employer would be that we are as flexible as possible. And so, yeah, I think ultimately it could well be a full-time position. And of course, you know, we don't have a DPW director, and that's a really important relationship to get right. So I'm really hoping that if we were to get a replacement, that we can then fill the DPW director position and they can establish a productive working relationship, and then we can move from there. But I'm a little hesitant to advertise it as a full-time position from the get-go.
Okay, good, Claudette.
Just another question, how Is there any possibility that part of the work could be done remotely, or does it need to be all in person?
That's a good question. I think that, again, the key there would be the Public Works Director position, if that was filled. Depending on the work habits and expectations of that person, I think that the job could be in large part done remotely, which might make it more attractive to many candidates. I think in the short term, there are literally 1.5 computers at Public Works right now, and a staff of people, the road crew, that use their phones and don't really interact with each other or Masaki, the administrative assistant, via email or from computer to computer. So there's a way in which that position is the interface between the crews that go out early in the morning and come back in the afternoon, and they're really remote in the sense that they're not connected to the normal kinds of equipment that you would use to work remotely, like laptops and so forth. So I think there are challenges thinking about how to set that position up as a remote remote work job, if that's the right term. Solely, I think that there needs to be face-to-face interaction as probably the most efficient between that person and the work crews as they come in and out of the highway garage.
Okay. Thanks so much, Rod. Any other questions? And thank you, Mary, for your question that got us on that discussion. Go ahead, Rob.
So I wouldn't want to forget that amongst the uses for the ARPA money and the funds that are coming through the state from the federal government, signing bonuses and other salary perks, those are allowable expenses. If it would help us find somebody, it might be worthwhile.
I'm glad you raised that. I had been contemplating how best to go about that, but I think perhaps being very aggressive or competitive in our search process would make a difference.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Rob and Rod. Let's maybe move on. How's that? Okay. The next is the ChargePoint EV charging station. Who wrote that? The Action Board will affirm decision of direction and management of the network plan and the extended warranty. There was supporting documentation authored by our intermunicipal regional coordinator. Rod had reviewed it and the recommendation when it was submitted to the packet. So I'm going to actually ask Rod to introduce this really quickly, or I see that Jeff Martin is here, but I will defer to Rod on whether or not he would like to speak to it or point to Jeff.
I'm happy to introduce it, and then I think if there are detailed questions, people that select board can either direct their questions to me and or Jeff.
Okay, great.
First of all, I want to say thank you to Jeff and Dan Fraser for being able to follow this through when we're really busy and put together a clear and succinct memo. So I just want to try and give a little bit of context and background. I'm sure most of you already know this, but the EV charging station that's located in the corner of Dan and Whit's parking lot is actually owned by the town, and so there's a question of if it's going to continue, what's the best way of doing that? So the first cut here is a policy question. I think that the town supports the idea of having an EV charging station somewhere accessible to downtown, and we've been very lucky to benefit from Dan and Whit's graciously hosting that location on the corner of their lot. And this memo basically outlines some different ways of achieving the goal of maintaining the EV charging station so that the public can continue to use it. The recommendation is to work with option 4, which is that the town would continue to own the charging station, but that we would enter into an agreement with Dan and Whit to cover all the costs associated with the charging station. And Dan and Whit has agreed to that. This would include electricity, and which would simply go onto the meter of Dan and Whit's. And so basically the town would maintain ownership of the charging station, and the Dan and Whit's would cover the, have the accountant cover the cost of paying the electricity that the EV charging station uses. So
Okay.
I think it's pretty straightforward, and I don't think it's particularly expensive. So I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm happy if Jeff wants to jump in at this point and add anything that he thinks is important for the board to know in contemplating this suggestion.
Okay, Jeff Martin, who's our intermunicipal regional coordinator, would you like anything to add to Rod's summary of your summary?
No, it's a great summary of the summary. No, I guess I'd just add that Dan Fraser or Dan and Whit would be covering the cost in addition to the electricity, which would be put onto the Dan and Whit's electricity meter. Dan and Whit would be covering the cost of the network fees, which are what allow the owner of the station to collect fees from users. And also an insurance plan. So those things would also be covered under this agreement with Dan and Whit. And essentially, we were just looking for sort of a quick, easy way to keep this charging station operational without needing any legal review for the transferring ownership to Dan and Whit, and also to keep the easements in place with Dan and Whit that the town currently has, so that if in the future Dan and Whit decides that they don't want to continue to cover the costs, the town could at that point choose to keep the station running without having to renegotiate the easements. So that's why we kind of are recommending option 4.
Okay, any board member questions for either Rod or Jeff Martin? Rob, I see your hand.
It wasn't so much a question as a comment. Is that appropriate? Okay. The Energy Committee met on Tuesday, and amongst the discussion, it was suggested that either taking over ownership or no, pardon me, giving ownership to Dan, as well as him keeping everything running, the ownership by the town with him taking care of the expenses and reaping the profits, whatever they may be, was also a very acceptable option. There was also discussion of changing the billing method for users that would make it more attractive to people who have different vehicles. Right now, it's an hourly charge for being connected. The ability to charge per kilowatt hour of actual usage has apparently been approved by the state and the company, and should make it more attractive for usage.
And so as a follow-up to Rob's question, who would be the decision maker in these kinds of changes in the future under this recommendation? Jeff, I see you.
Yeah, I guess, that's a great question. So I would guess that since the town, that's something that we'd have to work out with Dan and Whit, but since the town would maintain ownership of it, the town would have control over the fee structure. So that probably just have to be something that the town and Dan would have to come to an agreement on. But ultimately, if the town retains ownership of the charging station, the town has that final say of what the fee structure would be.
Okay, and then my next question, forgive me, board members, is Rod mentioned that this recommendation comes with the sort of direction to enter into a reciprocal license agreement or an agreement. And would the agreement work out these kinds of matters? Or potentially?
It potentially could. I guess from an administrative point of view right now, I'm not sure how Jeff feels, but I think at this point, we've come this far with leaving things pretty much the way they are. So
okay.
A continuation of the existing things. I'd be inclined to want to press ahead with things in those terms, but maybe what we need to do is include it in a written agreement between us and Dan and Whit, that at the end of the first year we get to review, the agreement and make any, people can suggest changes at that point. I'd like to give Dan the opportunity to go, this is not working for us, we'd like to get out or whatever. So I think that a check-in at the 12-month point would be the best way to approach that.
Okay, lovely. And I see that Jeff is nodding. Any other board member questions? I see Marcia has her head up.
So forgive my absolute ignorance about this, but I assume that this, like anything else mechanical, needs some sort of maintenance and attention once in a while. And my lawyer soul worries that, if the maintenance isn't done properly and someone's Lexus gets blown up, then the town is responsible because we own the charging station that wasn't getting maintained as it should have been. So how do we handle that?
Currently, the town, sorry, excuse me.
Well, no, tell us.
Currently the town has a maintenance plan. It's called ChargePoint Assure. And so basically the ChargePoint is responsible for keeping up with the maintenance of the charging station. And that's something that the town's paying for through this insurance plan. That's something that could be renewed so that, it's not on the town or Dan and Whit's to figure out the maintenance of the station. It would be on ChargePoint. And I will say that currently the charging station is down. It's not operable. So we're working with ChargePoint to try to figure that out and get someone out there to fix it. But because of that maintenance agreement, it's ChargePoint's responsibility. And so that's probably something that the town would want to continue with.
Okay, Rod, do you have anything to add before Marcia follows up?
Sure. So I would say that my expectation was that the maintenance plan would be something that that as a cost would actually be part of Dan and Whit's responsibilities as described in item number 4, as a matter of fact, but which is to say costs associated with the charging station. So it reads now, enter into an agreement with Dan and Whit to cover all costs associated with the charging station. So hang on a second. So I think, yes, I think that the question, I'm sorry, I misread that. So I think the question is, would we maintain the maintenance plan? We probably would, given the complexity of the piece of equipment and the benefit that the charging station provides to the broader community. I would say that it's not been without its challenges as a piece of equipment, but my understanding of the way it works is either it works and therefore there's no risk to the vehicle that's being charged, or it just doesn't work. So I think it's designed to actually be a fairly low risk device. I think Marsha's example of the car blowing up is thankfully a remote one, and I'd like to keep it that way. We've had, like I said, it's been on and off, but for the most part, it's been fairly dependable. And I think that it's a policy question for the select board in the town. If we have a commitment to providing access to EV charging stations, do we want to take on this responsibility of maintaining this device. And I would say from a policy stance, my position would be that we should do that.
Okay.
So Marsha's got to follow up. So.
Yeah, go ahead, Marsha.
So I just get really worried when we have split things like this, and the bottom line is we're retaining ownership. So my preference would be either to hand it off and then pick it up again if it fails, if we need to, or pardon me.
Clarify the it for me.
I mean, if rather than retain ownership, I don't know what we're gaining by retaining ownership. If Dan wants the station handed over to him and let him run it, but if we're going to be liable ultimately because we own the thing, I think we have to, we can't absolve ourselves by saying somebody else is going to take care of it. It doesn't work that way. And so I always use, bizarre examples to make the point. And while it might not blow, the car might not blow up, it might do some damage. And so our job is to think about the risks. And so if we're going to be thinking about this in terms of a split, however we want to do it, I think it has to be formally put into some contractual agreement that our attorneys look at.
Right, and this will be subject to an agreement, and all agreements have attorney review, is what I say that with a question mark to see if Rod is gonna nod. Yes, he's nodding. Okay.
I appreciate. I want to just say, Marsha, I really appreciate your raising the questions around liability, and I think that's something that the agreement is going to need to address. And I agree that we can't absolve it. If we own it, then we can't absolve ourselves of that liability. And so I think it's just a situation where we're going to try and minimize the conflict. I guess the recommendation is a way of ensuring that the charging station continues in its location and people continue to have access to it, and trying to respond to this gracious offer from Dan and Whit to take on some of the responsibility of paying for the electricity that it uses.
Okay, go ahead, Marsha, and then I'm gonna try to.
Perhaps we could pose it to them to see if Dan and Whit wants to take ownership, or, I mean, what is the advantage other than we assure ourselves that it's available to people, which we could presumably do again if it was suddenly not available to people.
So Jeff, you had some conversations with Dan and Whit in preparation of this memo. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, again, I think the whole intent was just to make this to ensure that the station continues to be operable as we come up on the expiration of the network and assure plan. So if the better option and easier option is just to transfer ownership to Dan and Whit, I don't want to speak for Dan Fraser, but based on our conversation, I think he would be open to that. But we were just trying to think about how can we make sure that this doesn't expire and it continues on in the easiest fashion. But I'd be happy to talk with Dan again, and I think he would be open to taking over ownership of it.
Well, so we've heard from Marsha on this, but I haven't heard from other folks, and there's obviously a recommendation that comes with this memo. So what are some other, I want board members to respond to what Marsha has proposed and that Jeff just responded to, and then I will either ask for a motion or to table. Go ahead, Claudette.
Well, I have no strong feelings either way, whether we own it or Dan and Whit owns it. If we choose to move that we continue to own it, I feel confident, based on Marsha's questioning, that Rod will continue with the fixing plan, whatever you want, however.
The maintenance plan.
Yeah.
Maintenance plan.
Yeah.
So if we, so I'm fine if we continue to own it as long as we maintain the maintenance plan, but I'm also fine with having Dan and Whit's assume ownership, but I do remember reading in the memo that there is a expiration that's coming up very, very, very soon. So I think we kind of need to make the decision tonight, because I really don't want to have a special meeting just to make this decision.
Right, because we have so many other things we can discuss, right? Yes, absolutely. So Mary and Rob, any other thoughts? And then either I will entertain a motion after that.
I think it's beneficial to the town. It's beneficial to me. Next time when we start meeting in person, I usually plug in the charge there. But I think on the whole, it potentially brings business into the town of Norwich, and if nothing else, it's a convenience for residents who are doing business in that area.
Right, Mary, any thoughts?
I had the impression that there were some easement difficulties if we did not retain ownership. Is that true? That Dan and Whit's would have to go through a process with easements?
That's correct, Mary. I think that the appealing aspect of this solution, or this option number 4, is that it minimizes the amount of paperwork and the legal costs associated with the easements that are currently in place. So sort of the lowest cost, easiest path to ensure that by November the 7th, we've got something in place so that the charging station stays operative and in place.
Okay, and the other thing I'll add is I appreciate Marcia's concerns. I trust that an agreement will address that. I'm glad there is an agreement, right? I think that's good. But otherwise, I'm comfortable with the suggestion, particularly because it seems like it was made in the effort to preserve town resources. So go ahead, Marcia, and then I need to call the question.
I've never run into an easement that needed to have be re-upped, but maybe there is one. So I don't understand why that would be a problem. You either have one or you don't have one. But I do think we need to talk to Dan again. I would recommend that we talk to Dan as part of this process to see if there's something that we can do so it's cleaner. I think this is just a wee bit messy.
Okay. And Marcia, we're only approving a recommendation. We're not approving an agreement, right?
Will we see it?
Will we see it in time before November 7th?
That's a good question. November the 7th isn't very far away. So, and I would of course like to have the agreement in place so that the ChargePoint people actually know that it's been transferred to Dan and Whit's before the end of the existing contract. So today's the 27th.
We're scheduled for our budget conversations to have a special meeting on the 3rd.
Hopefully we could have something for the packet for the 3rd, but that is kind of pushing it, I think.
Okay, Jeff, go ahead. I see your hand, but then I'm going to ask my colleagues for a motion.
Sorry, I talked to ChargePoint today, and because the station has been down for the last couple of weeks, they are going to grant us a bit of an extension. So there is a little bit more time than we initially thought. So that's, we can relax a little bit with the timing.
Okay, that's great. Did they, Jeff, sorry to cut across, Roger. Did they happen to mention a number of days? Or they just left it kind of loose?
Yeah, they left it loose. I'll follow up with them tomorrow and get
even if
something in writing.
Even if it was to the end of November, that would be great,
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Certainly, at least until they fix it.
Yes.
Okay, so we've heard Marcia had raised some concerns. I heard some generally broad support for the recommendation, but either way, I leave it to you. Is there a motion that someone would like to make or not?
Leave it to, didn't catch it.
Is there a motion that someone would like to make or not?
Yeah, I'd like to just move what's on our sheet here. It was option number 4. Are you hearing me? Okay.
We are. Thank you, Mary. Now,
Okay.
now
Are you,
we
can you
are.
hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So
Go ahead.
I move to affirm the town manager's decision to enter into an agreement with Dan and Whit concerning the ownership and operation of the electric vehicle charging station per memorandum from Jeff Martin, as included in the select board meeting packet.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, by member, second by Rob. Any further discussion on this?
I'd like to table it until we have more information.
Okay. We have a motion on the table, so I'm going to take your comment as a discussion point. Okay. Any other discussion? Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, I'm gonna roll call. Claudette, how do you vote?
Yes.
Rob, how do you vote?
Yes.
Marcia, how do you vote?
Abstain.
Okay, Mary, how do you vote?
Yes.
And I'm a yes. Okay, thanks so much. And then sounds like we'll have this conversation will evolve. Okay, I'm gonna move on. Thank you so much, Jeff Martin. I understand too that you've been working with Linda Gray on this, so thank you Linda Gray has been providing as a point person because she is our rep for the intermunicipal regional coordinator position. So thank you, Linda, and of course, thanks, Rob. Okay. Next agenda item, town manager profile from VLCT consultant. So board will be approving the profile. Would it be appropriate to begin with a motion and then have a discussion? Or would we?
Sure. Yes, let's do that.
Go ahead.
I move to approve the town manager position profile meeting packet.
Okay, there's a second. Second by Claudette, I saw. Mary Claudette. Okay, any discussion on this? Go ahead, Marcia.
On page 26, I think it was, the description of the core, commercial core of the town is in the southeast corner of the town, I think is incorrect. I count 4 businesses there, and they're not all tourist and drop-in, other than King Arthur. We have more businesses in the middle of town, and you can count them. And then there's a mistake on page 29, 3rd paragraph. There's a period after the word budget in the 2nd line. That's it.
Okay. Any other discussion? I think it's fine. I think it was fine as is. I appreciate that it was put together and seeing it laid out. Okay, so Marcia, I'm happy to make the typographical alert Rick McGuire to the typographical correction. Do folks have any further comments to Marcia's point about the commercial tour? Otherwise, I'll assume it can be left as is. Go ahead, Marcia.
I just think it's factually incorrect. I mean, all you have to do is count the number of businesses, and it may be that there's a lot of people in town who wish that that was the case, but there's 4 businesses on that side of town. And so I think if we're positing this to the public, people are going to be looking for something that isn't there and they're missing what's in the town. So I'm just thinking it's a misrepresentation of our town. And I think that I'm a little embarrassed about it going out like that.
Good, Claudette.
Marcia, could you point out again where you're
Yeah,
referencing that geographic information? I'm trying to look and I'm not.
I don't either.
It's the fifth paragraph,
96.
first page of the profile starts with this word.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Norwich's current land use pattern includes.
Okay. Good, Claudette.
I guess it depends on what they're considering the southeast corner, how extensive that southeast corner is.
Well, I mean, all I count is King Arthur Fogs in that little area, the farm stand and the co-op service center. And that gets you almost, I mean, I don't know what else is down there.
So I think actually the sentence is intended to suggest that the village is in the southeast corner of the town, not that in the southeast corner of the town there's a commercial district.
They didn't say Route 5 South, they said
Right. So
Southeast.
yeah, I think that Marcia might be jagging on the difference between the commercial and industrial district to the on the eastern side of Route 5 South. Whereas if you look at a map of Norwich and you try and find the village, it's in the southeast corner of the town.
I think it's more in the middle, but
So
Not by my estimate. I mean, you know, it's walking distance from the Connecticut River, and the corner of town where Thetford and Sharon meet is not walking distance from the village.
Okay, Claudette, why don't you go, and then I'm going to ask for this discussion to be anything about the actual characteristics described in a town manager, which is outlined in this.
I was just going to say, I read that draft as Rod has explained that yeah. So I have no problems with how it's drafted. Because I do agree that the village itself is kind of like nestled in the southeast quadrant of the land mass of the town of Norwich.
Yeah, okay. And so, and does anyone have any particular comments about the actual profile of the town manager characteristics that Rick McGuire observed from our interviews? Go ahead, Mary. You're on mute, Mary. I don't know if that's helpful.
Okay, sorry. I think the profile also, it represents our current state of the town where we do need to concentrate on personnel. And I think, as is always true, we want a very good interface between
This is rough.
the town manager and the public. And I think it's quite good.
Okay. Go ahead, Marcia.
I had rated financial competence a little higher than is indicated in the document, but they do talk about it a little bit farther down.
Okay. All right, that's all. I'll note that for Rick. Okay. Anybody else? Otherwise, it seems like I can ask for a motion or call the question rather. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Roger, Cheryl has her hand up.
Oh, yes, thank you so much. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Yes, Cheryl Lindbergh, 59 Koch Road, and we don't have a water district in Norwich. We have a Norwich Fire District that owns and operates a water system.
Okay.
And I just think that would be a good correction to have.
Sure. So I'll alert that. So there's one typographic correction and then a fire district that operates water. Go ahead, Marcia.
And I wondered, is it true that the possibility of merging the fire district with the town and establishing a municipal water department will need to be evaluated? I haven't really heard anybody say that that's a necessity.
I've heard the fire district say as such.
It's been talked about.
Would you like to say may instead of will?
Probably, yes.
Sure. Okay.
That's fair. I think it's part of strategic planning.
Okay, so I'm still considering, and board members help me out with this, I'm considering these changes minor, so we don't need to our motion, but if they're not minor, then please weigh in on that, and then I'll ask for some amendments. We're good?
I think they're minor.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to call the question if that's okay. All in favor of approving the town manager profile from VLCT, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you so much. Next item on the agenda is a density study. The action is to approve entering into a contract with AES East. So I'm going to ask for a motion, and then we'll turn to Rod for a little bit of a framing as part of the discussion. Go ahead, Claudette.
So I move to approve the Town of Norwich award a contract to AES Northeast not to exceed $15,000 for the completion of the density factor review, a project supported by the Municipal Planning Grant Program of the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development, and also supported by our Planning Commission.
Second.
Okay, made by Claudette, seconded by Rob.
I'll second.
You're late.
Okay. 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 So, do folks have any? Would people want to hear sort of a brief explanation from Rod, or would they like to? Have any questions? Actually, Rod, why don't you give us, your best minute, 30 seconds, sort of framing this for us, and then if board members have questions, we'll take them. How's that?
Okay, I'm going to go as fast but as smoothly as I can.
I appreciate it.
So back in 2020, we applied for a municipal planning grant and were successful. The value of the contribution from the state is $13,650, and the contribution from the town is 10% of that grant value, giving you a total of just over $15,000. And so the scope of the work is to analyze the settlement patterns from 1992 to 2002, and then from 2002 forward to 2021. So capturing effectively 40 years of development, subdivision development in Norwich. The purpose of which is to reflect on the contribution that a change in the subdivision regulations from 2002 have made to Norwich settlement patterns. This is background work necessary for us to rewrite the land use regulations, which is the Planning Commission's project for this year. So after going out with an RFQ, AES was a respondent, and after interview and seeking references from other clients of theirs, I was able to reach a conclusion that they would be a suitable partner for the town to do this work. So if you have any other questions, please let me know.
Great. Any questions? Go ahead, Marcia.
Rod, in the background paragraph, the last sentence is the intent of the study is to complete a before and after comparison to measure the effectiveness of this land use regulation tool. That doesn't make any sense to me. The last part of it, you're doing a comparison to measure the effectiveness of a tool.
Yes. So the density factor analysis that's the tool that we use to establish how many parcels can be subdivided out of the primary parcel in a subdivision application. And so I ran through this with the group, I think, at the last select board meeting. And so that density factor analysis is a land use regulation tool. It establishes the number of potential parcels that can be subdivided subsequent to the original subdivision. And those parcels, that number of parcels, is recorded on the plat in a table in Norwich, and so they are vested rights that the subdivision applicant over the permitted subdivision allows for, and that can be transferred to subsequent owners as a vested right. So that's the tool I've just described. The density factor analysis is the tool that does that. It establishes the number of parcels that can be further subdivided from the original parcel. Does that explain?
Well, no, I got that before, but what I don't understand is how it measures the effectiveness of the tool. How does the activity?
So we had a land use pattern before 2002 that this tool, that this amendment to the subdivision regulations was intended to correct. And so by comparing before and after, we can see whether the tool's been effective or not.
And if it wasn't?
That would be information that the Planning Commission would use when it comes time to redraft the subdivision regulations, and if they found it to be ineffective, they would have the options of deleting it, modifying it, or using a different tool to achieve the outcome, the desired outcome, if they still believe that outcome to be desirable.
Go ahead, Marcia.
So follow-up question, if it isn't effective, do we have to pay for another study to find something that is effective?
Why not? Now I want to know.
Because it's a very particular tool. Norwich, I think, is the only community that I've ever encountered that does this. And so I think that as a planning professional, I could suggest other techniques or other methods to achieve a similar outcome. And one of those, which is the most obvious one in some ways, is to actually create more zoning districts and then actually use the permitted uses and the dimensional standards for different zoning districts to achieve a similar outcome. And so there's a menu of other ways of achieving the same goal, and you wouldn't need to do a study to figure that out.
Okay, thanks, Rod. I see Rob's hand up.
Are we referring to two different tools? The tool of zoning regulations and separately, completely separately, the tool of doing a density analysis. You've used the same tool reference for both of them, but one of them is referenced in the description. Is that appropriate? Is that correct?
You've isolated a personal shortcoming and a tick where I use the word tool to actually refer to something that you can't fix the sink with. So it's kind of a metaphor in a way, and that I use it interchangeably for other things. So thanks for that, Rob. Now I'm embarrassed and I'm going to try and unravel this. So zoning regulations are a framework for controlling the development of land in town. And you could think of it as comprising multiple tools. And in this instance, I'm talking about a very focused small tool, the density factor analysis tool that we use for one particular application, which is to determine how many parcels a large parcel can be subdivided into. So the example I think I gave last time was if you've got 100 acres, once you exclude a set of factors, including slope and distance from town and whether the road is paved or gravel and a whole bunch of other factors, that's how you determine how many times you can further subdivide that parcel. So 2 parcels, exactly 100 acres, one might be on Route 5 North and therefore be suitable to be subdivided 10 times, 10 acre parcels. And you could have another one on the border of Sharon on a dirt road that's 100 acres, and you might come up with the answer of 2. That's how the density factor tool works. So the question is the density factor tool giving the town the outcome that it expected and wanted by applying that tool in the first place? And so the only way to do that is to compare life before the tool and life after the tool.
Hence the study.
Hence the study, exactly.
Okay, so
I hope that helps. I'll try using tools in a very particular way.
No, actually, I'll speak for myself and say I think that was, I appreciate the questions that brought forward all the explanation. I think it was really helpful for our knowledge. I do not envy our planning commission colleagues for their work. So any other questions? Otherwise, I'm gonna call the question. All right. Thanks so much for these questions. Okay, all in favor of approving approve entering into a contract with AES Northeast, please raise your hand. I don't see your, okay, Mary, is your hand up, Mary? Okay, Mary's freezing, so I'm gonna need to do roll call, okay? Marcia, how do you vote?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, I see Mary's hand and she said yes, and then I saw all the other
I
hands.
said yes.
So that was unanimous, okay? Thank you. All right, so now we're ahead of schedule by 1 minute. So you've earned yourself an extra minute. We're gonna take a break and we'll come back at 7:55, okay? Thank you so much.
Recording stopped.
Roger?
I'm waiting for some folks to return, some screens to turn on. Okay, I see Claudette. I think Mary might be coming into town.
Oh, like physically?
Physically, but unless she's still on and I can, okay, no, there she is.
Oh, no, there you are.
Mary, it's been suggested that you reboot your computer, or restart your computer.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, restart. And then
I'll
join
do
us.
that. I'll return.
Okay.
Okay. Yep.
Recording in progress.
Okay, it's 7:57. I'm resuming the October 27th meeting. Mary Layton has some technical difficulties. She's restarting her computer and will join us as soon as we can. As she can. Okay, the next item on the agenda is the operating budget FY23. The interim town manager and finance director to present summaries from each department. I think we're going to be hearing a presentation slightly different than the action describes. But I'm going to actually immediately turn it over to Rod to sort of take us through the working process that him and Fielding have developed for the budget. He, earlier in the town manager report, he referenced the conversation of September financials and how that work might inform where we are now and where we are going with the budget. So Rod, is it okay if I turn it over to you, and then we'll probably hear from Fielding. We can take at least another 5 minutes on this. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Roger. So just very quickly, I'm planning to hand it over to Fielding as quickly as possible. So at the last select board meeting, I believe it was Claudette that raised the question of where are we at in this budget, given that it's now October, we should have been able to close out September, and that would give us an indication of how well we're doing in the current budget, and then of course that would be useful for reflecting on what we need to do in the coming year's budget. So I'm doing the purpose of my introduction is to say that Fielding and I have been working on that quite a bit. I'm working with department heads continuously since the last select board meeting, building the operational budget for FY23. And in doing so, we've also been reflecting on and thinking about how things are going for FY22. I should point out with a big asterisk here that due to the relatively new position for me to be in as interim town manager and Fielding being new to town, our institutional knowledge of how to compare the first quarter of a financial year to other financial years is hampered just because we don't have that institutional knowledge. And of course, some departments spend a lot of their money in summer, think here recreation, and to some extent building and grounds in public works. And then other departments spend a lot of their money on activities in the winter, think public works again, doing snow plowing with overtime and equipment and materials. So it's not the case that every department is going to be at exactly the same point in the cycle of expending the funds that have been allocated to them in the budget for any one year. So I want you to just think about that and go with that piece of information, and then I'm going to turn it over to Fielding, and we'll talk about what we found in the September numbers, talk briefly about where we're at in terms of progress through this financial year, and then we'll switch gears to the operational budget for FY23. Thank you.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Fielding. Welcome.
Thanks, everyone. I think that was a great intro, Rod. To kind of put some numbers in front of you. As of right now, I'm going to exclude the monetary articles, and by which I mean the appropriations we make to advanced transit, WISE, family place, those type of things that we make 2 payments typically a year to those organizations, and focus primarily on operations of the town. I think that gives you the best picture. for what you're dealing with. Through the first quarter and actually the first cycle of payroll in October, so a little bit more than the first quarter, but not a full 4 months. The town has spent $1,015,828. That's compared to a budget of $4,780,866. As Rod touched upon, I think this is actually about where I would expect to be going into the winter season. Knowing that we have yet to expend any money on road salt, sand, overtime for the Public Works Department, which is our largest department staffing wise, so on and so forth. So if anything, we might be trending a little bit under due to Herb's departure, a lack of a DPW director, vacancies in a road crew position, as well as a police officer. And then I did not start until September. So that was 2 months of time without a finance director as well. So I think we have seen a little bit of savings there. In terms of how this helps us inform our requests in our operation budget projections for fiscal year 23, some things do jump off the page. I did combine that with the fiscal year 21 actual numbers as well, to help kind of rebuild this knowledge base that has departed with those positions that I mentioned previously. In doing so, we were able to make some adjustments with the budgets, but I think ultimately we're coming in pretty much flat compared to the fiscal year 22 budget in terms of our requests. With that, I'm going to share my screen. So just give me 1 second here. I can get to. And 1 second. There we go. Okay, can everyone see the Excel spreadsheet I have up?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. This gives you the previous 3 years fiscal year budgets, our current fiscal year 22 operating budget, as well as the projected fiscal year 23 budget. Right out of the gate, I do want to kind of point out as a caveat emptor, this is a working budget, so these numbers could be subject to change. That being said, I think they're relatively close to what to expect as we go through this process, and a good foundation to build upon. What I'd like to do is kind of point out the highlights that would be major changes, I think, compared to what you're familiar with for fiscal year 22. And I'm just going to go down the line very briefly for each one and point out those changes. But as you can see, we're looking at tentatively right out of the gate about a 2.16% increase overall, which I think is pretty solid given the inflationary pressure that we've kind of spoken about in previous meetings. Starting with town administration, I think the largest line item that jumps off the page to me is our professional services budget. This is primarily focused on legal fees. Historically, this has been budgeted at about the $50,000 range. We have consistently come in substantially over that. And we are on pace in fiscal year 22 through the first quarter to come over by about 140%. And we're on pace for about $120,000 for that line. So I am forecasting an increase on that line from $51,667 to $97,500 for the fiscal year 23 budget. That does make up the majority of that 15.4% increase that you'll see in that town administration bucket, so to speak. I think the other thing to be aware of and to highlight for that bucket is the eventual town manager replacement's wage. There is a bit of a window there that you guys have discussed. Depending on where that salary settles, or even if it's outside of that range, I think you should be prepared to see that could affect that budget line relatively substantially, 3 to 5 percentage points either direction. So I would keep that in mind as well. Moving down to the BCA or the statutory meetings lines, I think the big thing to point out and to remind everyone is that fiscal year 23 will have an election in the fall of 2022, which is making up why those numbers are jumping up. They're relatively small amounts comparatively to a $5.3 million budget. A couple $1,000 here or there is not going to break the bank. But that is going to be the reasoning behind those numbers increasing for those. The town clerk doesn't have very much in terms of operations changes. You're really just looking at some inflationary pressure, COLA increases, and the projected 2.36% wage increase you're seeing there, and that has been largely offset with some savings in the healthcare budget or health insurance, which we will see kind of across the board has really helped in terms of our labor costs, in terms of keeping that increase below the kind of the inflationary number that people are seeing in the news and such. Moving on to the finance department, you are seeing about a 15% increase. This is largely driven through health insurance, actually, in this case. And the reason being is that Becky, the prior administrative clerk for the finance department, did not take advantage of the town health insurance policy. Given our anticipation of hiring a full-time replacement for that position, I would expect and would want to budget for health insurance. I would plan on that being probably a family level expenditure, which is a pretty substantial number, looking at give or take $20,000 in terms of a liability for that, and makes up the vast majority of that increase. I have also budgeted for a smaller number, about $2,500 for professional services. As that position grows, that admin assistant position, as well as myself into the role and getting familiar with NEMRIC primarily, I have budgeted a little bit of money to utilize NEMRIC's training services to assist in that. The last item, which makes up about $500 for an increase, is for a cell phone stipend, which I am proposing across the board for all department heads. Given the reality of kind of post-COVID, and as well as, I'm working right now remotely from home, zooming into this meeting, and they're just kind of the reality of modern management. I think we are all utilizing our cell phones pretty heavily, and I have priced that equally across the board at the $40 per month level that you see on our Verizon plan for the phones the town pays for exclusively. Moving on from there, we go down to general administration. This is kind of a catch-all bucket for telephone postage, the postage Pitney Bowes machine that we use to mail things, our copier for Tracy Hall, as well as the biggest line item is going to be what is currently called server maintenance, but is really kind of our IT line, which is where CCI and our managed IT services falls. As you are aware, we have contracted out our IT services with them. That falls to about a just over $3,000 a month cost. which is doubling our server maintenance line, which historically has been in the $7,000 to $17,000 range. That is jumping up. I have projected to about 38,600 or so, which is more than double actually, but does cover an all-inclusive package that covers all of our IT management needs. We have also continued to fund our designated fund for equipment for the eventual replacement of technology, computers, the Wi-Fi router, the OWL that is transmitting Rod and Miranda and Roger to you right now. And so we have allocated a $15,000 a year expense allocation for that to fund those inevitable replacements. That being said, we have taken a big hit for that this year, in this current fiscal year, replacing all of our equipment, where we had allocated $50,000 there. So that is you're going to see an overall decrease in that line of about 20%. Moving on to the listers, I think the biggest, they are showing an 11% increase. I think the biggest things to point out here are their continuing search for an assessing clerk. They have increased their wage, their projections for the wages for that position, about $4,500, just over $4,500, which I think is fair given the current market conditions. There's also a $7,000 increase in their request for their designated fund for the townwide reappraisal. As you guys are aware, in 2021, we have seen a rapid increase in terms of overall valuations for the town, and we will be quickly approaching the threshold that will trigger the requirement for a townwide reappraisal. So I would expect to have to expend these funds in the very near future. From there, we move on to the planning department. Here is relatively nominal increase at 4.63%. Here which is made up basically outside of staffing with a cell phone stipend, as well as a slight increase of about 20% in their mapping software line. So not too much to talk about there. For recreation, we are looking overall at about a 10% increase. There's a decent amount of movement on individual lines, but I think the biggest thing to note is there will be an increase in service level in terms of programs offered. As we come out of COVID, you're going to see more yoga, pickleball. There is a field hockey program hopefully coming online, all of which will bring in more revenue to offset. That being said, I think historically their instructor fee line has come in substantially under their typical request of $65,000. So those increased programming costs are offset with a more realistic projection for instructor fees. That being said, that leaves this 10% overage coming primarily from the request for a recreation admin assistant. This is going to be about a $22,000 a year expense. It would be a part-time 50% position and makes up basically the entirety of their request, or their 10% overage compared to fiscal year 22. From there, we move to the public safety facility as well as the police department. The public safety facility, outside of standard inflationary increases for electricity and those type of things just to operate the building. One thing we have seen is a substantial increase in the alarm monitoring line. As far as I can tell, we had a pretty cherry contract for several years prior to 2021. And upon renewal, that became more in line with current market conditions. And we're seeing increases of 330%, not only at the public safety facility, but also at our other alarm monitoring sites, Tracy Hall being one of those, which we'll touch on later. So that is just kind of coming into more of a realistic and current cost structure. They've also have to do some ongoing repairs and maintenance to the public safety building. I believe there's been some water leaks in the past, and that has kind of been trending at about a $5,000 a year expense throughout to manage those repairs. So I've increased that budget line from the 2,000 it was budgeted this year to 5,000 to bring that into more of historical norms. The police department actually shows some savings on their wages and benefits, which is nice. That is due to a new entry-level police officer coming on, as well as a new fire chief starting at a lower step range than the previous chief, Frank, was. So we do see a slight savings there. There's been a slight increase in the animal control budget. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of control over what gets spent there. And we have consistently kind of come in over, so I've done a slight increase there. Otherwise, the major increases are coming from an increase in fuel costs, as gasoline has really, substantially increased, as we touched base on previous meetings. And the biggest request is to change from in-car dash cams to body worn or body cams for the police officers. The interim chief, Simon, has proposed actually going with a full service kind of lease model for body cams that includes the data storage, the continual update to the latest and best technology, everything, the IT side of it, all of that is kind of done in-house or by one organization, and we would not have to really worry about it at all at a cost of $3,650 per year. That is an increase from our current in-cruiser video setups of about $1,000 a year, but is a substantial savings compared to us taking all of that capital expense on ourselves, which would be about a $40,000 one-time expense and then an ongoing storage fee of probably about $1,000 a year. So in that sense, I think it makes strong monetary sense to go that route and do the leasing through the body cameras. From there, we move on to fire, which is holding pretty steady at about a 3.6% increase. Nothing too radical in terms of changes here, other than vehicle fuel, which has gone up just like all the other petroleum products that we're seeing. So nothing very radical or anything that jumps off the page there. We go down to the Conservation Commission. This is after discussions with them over the last week or so. They have requested to come back in line to their more historical budget levels, which have fluctuated between $8,000 and $10,000, $11,000 previously. I have had them identify specific initiatives in terms of where they'd like to spend that money. And they have been able, to accommodate that, specifically through LEAP programs, specific trail initiatives, combating invasive species is a big one, or a big trend that I'm seeing there. And as I said, we'll get into more detail as these kind of conversations unfold over the coming months. Then we come to the Public Works Department. The Public Works Department, given the lack of a director, is probably the one budget that I think could change the most compared to what you see here in front of you. As we kind of dial that in and have further conversations, it is also as you can tell, our biggest budget substantially compared to the others. So it plays a big role in our overall monetary picture, and it's something I think we want to get right. That being said, we do have a relatively good picture of where we stand based off the work that Larry had done previously. And we haven't proposed really too many changes compared to what he has presented in the past. That being said, there were some specific projects, notably in the contracted services line, that were ongoing in fiscal year 22 that we have kind of, outside of their completion in fiscal year 22, we have not budgeted for them in fiscal year 23 as we wait for the new DPW director to come on board, whoever he or she may be. We didn't want to hamstring them with, specific, monetary regulations that they may or may not agree with their expertise. So we've kind of held steady at best, I think, in that budget. Buildings and grounds, pretty steady there as well. Not much to talk about in terms of changes. We have seen, I think, when we get to solid waste, a little bit of an increase in use, I would say, given, I think a lot of second homeowners have moved here more permanently and full time. So we have seen about a 15% increase in the solid waste facility usage, and have increased their budget accordingly to accommodate the disposal fees, primarily from Casella. That leaves us with Tracy Hall, which has really not changed too radically, other than I have baked in some anticipated inflationary pressure for electricity, heating, the general use and utilities for the building. From there, I have left all monetary articles. These are, shifting over to that kind of conversation with what we appropriate to advanced transit and the family place and those things. I have left those basically the same. The only thing that has changed is we did bring on a regional energy coordinator expense. This was budgeted in fiscal year 21. Nothing was actually spent in fiscal year 21, but that expense has shown up in early fiscal year 22. And so I have left that, the anticipated, it's about $15,000. That is the only difference in monetary articles. So with that, I will open it up to questions or any specific comments.
Thanks, Fielding. And can you just stop sharing? I'm going to stop your sharing for now. Yeah, there you go.
Yep, no problem.
Okay, so folks, this was obviously like an overview. Like I was taking some notes along the way. I'm sure all of you were. Any questions? I think the opportunity to ask really specific questions or relating to specific line items will come when we have our department heads with us at these meetings. But nonetheless, do folks have any sort of reactions on the sort of what has been outlined by Fielding this evening? Go ahead, Claudette.
Yeah, I just, in the town admin section, I just wanted to point out, in case you weren't aware, that we would know our Church Street Bridge, our Church Street Sidewalk project, where we were reimbursing the state for money that was previously spent, stops. Our obligation ends with this fiscal year, so that should be an extra 23,000, I believe.
Okay.
Caught Fielding or no? Was that?
I'm sorry, what'd you say, Roger?
Had you detected, had you included that in your total or not? Because I think that's.
My belief is that actually is down in the, DPW budget, not the town administration.
No, it was tagged under professional services.
Oh, okay. That is good to know.
I'm glad you brought that where that was hiding out. And then Fielding, I'll catch you up on the story behind that tomorrow, but it's good news that it's ending. So it was basically an agreement between us and the state that had us paying off an amount that for a project that we didn't proceed with. So basically if it ends this financial year, that's great news.
Sidewalk.
That is good news.
Go ahead, Claudette, you weren't finished though, I'm sorry.
No, I just had a couple of other questions, but those can definitely wait until we're in our bigger budget discussions. I just wanted to make sure that Fielding was aware of that.
Okay, great.
No, thank you. I appreciate that.
Any other folks have some like comments or questions about what was presented? Good, Marcia.
So good job, Fielding. I felt like I was understanding the big picture. Can you just sort of bring that back to, I mean, I'm looking at page 59 of the packet and I'm wondering how that relates to the big picture you just showed us. And is that what we're going to get into with the overall big budget discussion?
I don't know exactly what page 59 is referencing. It could be either the designated funds or the capital budget. I think you're referencing specifically.
Yeah, it's a spreadsheet with fiscal years 23 to 27. And
okay, that would be the CIP. So that does take into account appropriations to the respective designated funds. So the numbers you saw where I screen shared does show current year or projected fiscal year 23 allocations to those designated funds, which we'll go into more detail with in the following conversations.
Thank you.
So Fielding, just to be clear, it seems like your very preliminary estimation is looking at a 2.16% increase from last year. Is that right?
Yes, and I would highlight preliminary as we kind of fine tune these numbers. That could change. But yeah, we're trying to maintain that flat service level that you had requested.
And then, you know, there's some changes to staffing, and it seems like there's some significant improvements that are being proposed, while also seeing, you know, minor increase. So I know that, you know, DPW is still some open questions as we look to get more clarity, but nonetheless, I guess I would also like to sort of commend the process that you and Rod have developed, because we're seeing what we asked for, but also are sort of previewing, you know, some real evidence of some real dialogue with department heads, right? You know, and I just, so just an appreciation, I'll say.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, this is a snack, right? And so we'll have more meal and some line item discussions when we have our department heads, and the budget schedule, I believe, has us beginning with some of that on November 10th, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so if there's nothing further, then I'll move on to the status of the designated funds and review of their financing functions, is what I called it. Rod, would you like to set this up, or is there more discussion that you and Fielding will have for us on the designated funds and how they relate to this bigger picture, so to speak?
Yeah, let me just say that as part of our overall budget process, Fielding and I have been spending a lot of time looking at the construction of designated funds, how they've been used in the past, how they relate to the operating budget, and how they actually relate to the capital improvement plan. And we found some variations or some things that we need to investigate further to get a better understanding. And I think at that point, I'm happy to turn it over to Fielding, who can give you a quick rundown of where we're at with designated funds, if that's.
Yeah, that would be great,
okay.
and particularly how they're interacting with sort of our other budgets.
Right. I think the key here is a couple of things that before I hand it off to Fielding, and he can speak to this at more length. So the one thing that we found is that in the past year or so, the interest that we've been earning hasn't been dedicated to the individual designated funds. So that's kind of an accounting procedure, but it will change the numbers, and so be ready for that. And then at a deeper level, just a better understanding of what the designated funds are and how they get utilized. and how that's so those allocations are something that comes out of the operating budget, and we just need to pay attention to where we're at in the life cycle of things that are subject to the capital improvement, part of the capital improvement plan, and therefore that's what those designated funds are supposed to be used for. And so Fielding can talk at more length about that.
Okay, great. All right, go ahead, Fielding, please.
Thanks, Rod. So as you can see in the packet, this is kind of a very high-level overview of, the current fund status and the amounts in each respective fund. They're compared to the last town report, which is probably the last updated report you've seen on these funds. There are some variations, that are primarily based off decision makings on when we make purchases. I think a good example of that would be a police cruiser fund, like the police cruiser fund number 11. I think decisions to purchase a cruiser have not been made, but we had funded that fund or made allocations to that fund in anticipation of a purchase that has not occurred yet, but had been presented in the previous town report as if it was to occur. So there's been some variations with there. Rod did mention the interest as well. There are some important highlights I'd like to point out that for expenses that are upcoming. Notably, fund number 6 is going to have about $550,000 come out in late fiscal year 22 as their new fire truck arrives and is paid for. We also have the bill coming due, 2/3 of the bill that you had approved, I believe, back in June for an engine replacement for, I believe, ladder truck number 1. We will be paying that. You'll see that actually on the next AP warrant. So that will be coming out of fund number 6. That is going to draw that fund down pretty substantially.
Fielding?
As you can tell.
Fielding?
Yes.
Hi, it's Alex. That was engine 1, not ladder 1. Just as
Apologies.
As a point of information.
Yeah, apologies there. So engine number 1. That being said, you will see that expense come out of there, which is exactly what these funds are ultimately designed to accommodate. Primarily large capital assets. These are kind of savings accounts, so to speak, that you put money into this bucket over time in order to accommodate these large capital expenditures, primarily capital expenditures. So it doesn't come with a large hit instantaneously in 1 year. And the goal is to prevent, the town getting bogged down with, having to go out and borrow funds, whether that be a bond or a loan or any sort of those financial instruments. It's a little bit more of a prudent way to save for these capital expenditures. And prevent a one-time hit in a given year.
So Fielding,
Marsha, I see your hand up.
Has her hand up, but can you just, you referencing fund numbers, can you talk about, did you go undergo a process to number these funds?
So these fund numbers they were kind of, I inherited them. I have not, this is how they're.
My knowledge, I've never, and the board members can correct me, I have not seen this sort of rhetoric around them. So can you talk about it a little bit about that?
Okay, I see what you're saying. I think the way to look at it, and you've primarily probably operated based on fire apparatus, which is an apt descriptor in terms of what that fund actually does or what it's being utilized for. I guess the fund numbers are kind of the accountant's way of looking at. I reference fund number 6, and that's how we allocate the funds in NEMRIC. So I guess it is a little bit more on the technical side, or more accountant speak. So I apologize if that creates confusion. But that's kind of what the motivation is behind those numbers.
Great, thanks. And then Marsha, go ahead, your question.
Oh, it's more clarification. I think now we're talking about page 60. Is that true? It's the capital project appropriation spreadsheet. No? What are we talking about?
So this is a funding mechanism for those capital projects. So they work hand in hand. They
A
work
document that
hand
you
in
can share. You're referencing a document that we don't have fielding, which probably because you were developing it up until.
No, this is from the packet.
So what? I don't see it actually.
So-
So hold,
so
let's go get on the same page with that.
Okay, just hang on a second. So fielding, can you read out, just confirm for me that this is a letter size page, formatted landscape, and it's got a top designated fund balance.
Page 52.
And then it runs, the far left column starts the number 4 under the subtitle fund and runs through to 49. Is that correct? Is that the sheet?
Correct. That's what I'm referencing.
Okay.
Which is just basically the starting balance for the year, any current appropriation that will be coming in fiscal year 22, and then what that total fund balance will be.
Right. Okay, so it's page 52 in the packet, everybody.
That's helpful.
Welcome. Sorry about
So the second part of my question, or asking for clarification, I think of this as we ask on the warrant, do you want to fund this amount of money for X? That becomes a designated fund. And then each year, if we're going to keep doing that, unless we said we're going to do this every year for 5 years or whatever, we have to keep putting that on the warrant, right? So we have a little savings account that we've built up that's called a designated fund. And now I'm understanding that each of those designated funds have been by the finance officer, somebody, been given historically a fund number. Is that true?
Correct. I think it is important to highlight that these designated funds per Vermont statute have limited areas that you can spend those funds on, or the money within that fund on, I should say.
I spent a lot of time talking about that when I came on the board. So,
okay, so you're aware.
right. So I want to just make sure how much money is going in each year to each account so that we can keep track of what's in it now, what's going to be put in this year, next year, etc., and what's coming out so that we have a really good, strong picture of each fund.
Yeah, and that is where that capital improvement plan or that larger spreadsheet you were referencing comes into play. And that kind of gives you that roadmap over the next 5 years to track, in conjunction with this document here. You have your current status of where they are, and then you can see how we're continuing to not only expend money from those funds, but also allocate more money to each respective fund to save for the future. So if an expense in fiscal year 27, we're making appropriations to that respective fund in anticipation of that expense.
I don't suppose is it too much to ask that those could be merged?
We can. The hard part with the hard part with it is you do make appropriations to funds. Like a good example is the highway equipment fund. About a month and a half ago, we had to make a purchase of an air compressor utilized by the highway department, primarily for the repair and maintenance of their fleet, as well as their equipment, the attachment of plows for the winter, those kind of things. That was, we make a general appropriation of about $40,000 a year to that fund. And part of that is to accommodate these scenarios where that air compressor has a lifespan that ranges from 10 to 15 years. And so you don't know exactly when it's going to fail, but it will fail at some point. And so it's hard to project the exact status of a given fund 5 years ahead of time. because there are those scenarios. You know, that air compressor, the one we purchased, could last 15 years versus 12, or what have you. So the numbers get a little fuzzy or a little hazy, so to speak, in terms of getting it down to an exact number. We can get it pretty close, but there are those scenarios that are going to throw that exact, you know, in fiscal year 27, it might be $7,500 different, or 10,000, or whatever it is, depending on as those assets fail or need to be replaced.
I think, so Marcia, if you, I may, go ahead and finish up, but then I want Claudette and then.
Yeah. So page 52 is the current situation at a given moment today.
Correct.
And the appropriation is what we're saying we ask for each year.
That is what you asked for in fiscal year 22 and was budgeted. So the far right column is where they currently sit.
Got it. Thank you.
Go ahead.
So I just wanted to point out that I appreciate the numbering of the designated funds. I think it's much clearer. There's no ambiguity. My second point is just to clarify for Marcia, we do not put on the warrant every designated fund allocation as a separate warrant article. Our designated fund allocations are part of our general budgeting. So when the voters approve the budget, they are approving those designated fund allocations.
Exactly.
So that's helpful, but I'm just thinking for some things, isn't it advantageous, especially if there's any controversy about it, to make it a special line item on the warrant?
I guess that's a broader board discussion.
I think I could highlight an example that hopefully would clarify. And I think that would be to fund number 48, the Climate Emergency Fund. That is I'm going to say, for lack of a better term, a brand new fund that was created in, I believe, fiscal year 21. It did not exist before. And my understanding is that it came up kind of as an article during the town meeting that was voted upon to not only create the fund itself, but also appropriate $40,000 as the starting balance for that fund.
Right, and also often the forms of financing that are not through designated fund appropriation process also, as you know, come up for the article warning, right? So if we're looking to bond,
yes,
we would ask
It would
the
be
voters,
that would
but
be
otherwise if the designated fund is already established by the voters, then we make appropriations to it through the yearly budget process. Which
correct.
Mary is smirking because I think this is very familiar to her by now, which I appreciate. So let me, I see a public comment. Fielding and Rod, what is the purpose of this discussion? What is the polemic that you want us to understand in showing this to us? And what is it that we need to keep in mind going forward into the next item? So like, give me the sort of the polemic, or like why was effort expended on this?
Fielding, go for it.
I think the two main things, and I've touched base on them briefly throughout the conversation, are, these, for a lack of a better way of, and to keep it out of the technical side of things, is like they're effectively savings accounts for specific purchases. So when you see these numbers and you see $133,000 in the Conservation Commission, I think to keep in mind, you need to remember that $133,000 has been appropriated for a very specific purpose. And so it is not as you want to keep that in mind and not think you have $3.48 million to utilize for a given project. These funds have been appropriated over time for specific purchases or categories of purchases. And I think that is the big point to remember.
Let me put it in terms of an example. If we make an appropriation for, I'm going to say something we don't make appropriations for, so it's like totally depoliticized. So if we make an appropriation for a carousel 1 year, but it's not the full cost of the carousel, but then decide not to have the carousel, what does that mean from a policy perspective? So in other words, we're just saying that the carousel is $50,000 and we saved $15,000 1 year because we've appropriated the funds to the carousel designated fund, right? But then we decide that we don't actually want the carousel, or the carousel is further off. What does that mean for that $15,000 that's been authorized by voters through the operating budget? Does that make sense?
Sorry, Marcia.
What it means is
Rod's going to answer.
Yeah. What it means is that if you at some point, subsequent to putting money aside for the carousel, decide you no longer want the carousel, then you have to do the appropriate bookkeeping paperwork to dissolve that fund and reallocate the money that's in that fund. So you actually draw on a good example. So one of the things that we've got, Fund 16, you'll notice that we've got $1,297.76 in the recreation pool designated fund. We don't have a pool anymore, and as far as I understand, we're never going to have another one, or at least not. We're not proposing to have another one. So that, admittedly, is a very small amount of money. It's $1,297, but it could be reallocated to something else. And so it would take an action on the part of the select board and so forth to do some cleanup of the designated funds. And I think that part of the process here for both Fielding and I is to learn the scope of the designated funds, understand what the balances are, and understand what the purpose of those designated funds are.
That makes sense, but I think, and then I see other hands and I apologize, but then I guess I'm expressing, like, what does the sort of the funding of $15,000 towards the carousel mean to significantly, right? So in other words, like, if you have authorization from the voters to have this appropriation, there's presumably is the expectation that they would get this thing,
right?
And then we don't do that thing in any given year. Is that just bad policy, or is there some other questions we need to consider? Does that make sense?
It does. I wouldn't say it's bad policy. I mean, any community is capable of changing its mind. So circumstances may change, and say, for instance, the law covering carousels might change, and it might become exorbitantly expensive to build a safe enough carousel, so people decide that they don't want to pursue it.
Okay.
Then you got taxpayers' money, $15,000, that you have to reassign to something else that the taxpayers are aware of and can track.
Okay.
So you take it out of the carousel fund and you put it in the social service fund, or whatever designated fund you think is the most appropriate. It's worthy of a discussion at this level, and there'd be an appropriate set of steps that you need to take to reallocate those funds.
Okay, great, thanks. And Marcia had her hand up. Go ahead, Marcia.
I think under 2804, you have to use it for the specific purpose it was voted, or it has to be revoted.
Exactly. The next
Correct.
that you would use to reallocate.
Yes. Okay.
So
Great.
we can't just decide.
Right.
It's the town people that vote.
Right. Okay. I wanted to go through that example to get. We could have just said that perhaps, but nonetheless, maybe this was illustrative. I don't know. Okay. Let's take some. Did any other board members have some comments? And I said 2 public comments I want to take, and then I'm going to ask for a little break, and then we'll go into capital. Andy Sher, go ahead. Just state your name for us, please, before you speak.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Andy Sher, 23 Hazen Street. Just have a question in terms of that. It's been voted on. How broadly can one interpret the use of such designated funds? Is there some latitude within that? If you can address that, that would be great.
So I think the question is when voters authorize a fund, who determines a broader set of interpretations or goals for the expenditures? Is that perhaps?
Or uses, or if it's related but maybe not the specific original intent.
Sidewalk fund, and you're looking to construct a new sidewalk, perhaps? Is that the question? Sorry, Andy. Yeah. Okay. So yes. No. Okay, go ahead. Did you finish? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah. No. I think that sums it up.
Okay. Cool. Rod, do you have a thought on the sort of the question?
I think that in each instance it needs to be considered, and I would say that the devil is in the details. So I think you need to go back to the action that created the designated fund in the first place, and see what the purpose statement is. And it's always a balancing act between being so specific that it really constrains the town in terms of achieving the goal, and being so vague as to be for the town to be accused of basically parking money in various funds without any real intentions to spend it on a specific thing. So I think that when you see the vote on establishing a designated fund, that is what shows you the scope of use of that fund for that fund. And then if you're going to change out, if you're going to suggest a different project or a different deliverable with that designated fund, you need to first of all explain to the public why you think you can make that expenditure from the designated fund.
Okay.
And then be very clear to the public that that's what you're intending to do. And it's kind of a straight face test, I guess you could say.
Great. Thanks so much for your question, Andy. Marcia, your hand up, and then Linda Cook has her hand.
The language in the statute isn't that fuzzy. It just says may be expended for such purposes for which established, or you can vote again for other purposes. So I think it's pretty clear.
Right.
Great. Rod is agreeing. Okay, Linda Cook, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, Linda Cook. No, actually, Marcia has supported what I was going to speak on, because to reuse the funds, it has to be revoted by the public to be able to do that. So thank you, Marcia, for bringing that up.
Great. Any other select board comments on this designated fund discussion? Obviously, we'll see some continued work and cleanup on this, so we appreciate that. Andy Shear, did I see your hand again? I didn't mean to, I apologize for cutting you off earlier. I think I might have saw your repeat hand. Did you have a public comment?
No, it was answered. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so if it would be okay, can we take a little break till 9 and before resuming our last 2 agenda items? Would that be okay with folks? Thanks, I appreciate it. All right, so see you at 9. Okay, so I'm resuming a meeting at 9 o'clock on October 27th. Thanks so much for that. So I think we can maybe move on a little bit to sort of the capital budgeting, the summary of prioritized capital budget items. Can you walk us through, I think it's actually page maybe 60 now, Fielding, or can you orient us a little bit to this conversation?
Yes. So I think the purpose of this, and I apologize, it really works better as an Excel spreadsheet than it does as some documents placed in a packet. But hopefully you can get the picture of what we're going for here. And this has been kind of the first draft, so to speak, as we kind of come to this culmination of a CIP plan or a capital improvement plan. And Marcia, specifically, this is where we start highlighting, all of our capital assets and projects that we're working towards over the next 5 years, their total cost, their funding sources, are there any grant funds, and then how does that affect the net cost to the town, their overall lifespan, and then any recurring operating costs that result from the addition of that asset or the replacement of that asset. That can work both ways. So we look at Tracy Hall, which is right at the top, primarily funded through ARPA funds, and it would result, and I put a placeholder number in there, but there will be some significant energy savings on an annual operating cost basis from those renovations. That as opposed to, say, a side-by-side for the Parks and Rec Department that is going to is a new piece of equipment, is that going to have ongoing maintenance and repair costs, those kind of things. So really, this is kind of a document that is really trying to show that roadmap primarily over the next 5 years, as we strive to replace critical capital assets of the town, as well as their funding, where that funding sources come from, whether that be a designated fund, it could be fundraising, it could be grant funding, or it could just come from a one-time annual costs through the operating budget. We've talked about a lot of these individual projects already. The townwide reappraisal is included here. We've talked about some DPW projects. We've talked about the breathing apparatus and PPE for the fire department. And that's where these singulars go into much more detail. So the singulars are kind of that backup and justification. This is going to show you the roadmap to get there and to purchase that asset. The first 2 years on this document are fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 24. These include the priority level of the assets. So, for example, that breathing apparatus for the fire department is required to be replaced on a 15-year time frame. There's no real getting around that. And so that is going to naturally have a pretty high priority level in terms of what you should be focused on. And then the ranking is going to be ranked on that given year over all of the projects or assets being looked to replace in that given year. So the priority, they kind of work hand in hand together. There's the overall capital cost. There's the funding source for that. And then there's also the funding appropriation needed. So this is where that designated fund current balance sheet comes into play. So for example, the breathing apparatus for the fire department has already been funded and is currently, that specific item is fully funded in their designated fund. Currently, that's a big project or a big purchase, $117,000, give or take. And through previous due diligence of the voters and the select board, they have already allocated those funds for that purchase. That is opposed to, say, what would be a good example? The tanker truck replacement, which has not been allocated per se or specifically for, and would require, ongoing fund appropriations for. So it tries to illustrate what it's going to take, and then if you look at the very bottom, it kind of shows you what is the overall cost of the capital assets being replaced in a given year, and then what are the fund appropriations needed for that given fiscal year to make that happen. And you'll see there's always a little bit of a delta based on your due diligence in prior years. So for fiscal year 23, because you've already saved for the breathing apparatus for the fire department, you don't have to make an additional fund appropriation for it. And that explains that delta between the $685,000 in capital assets we're looking to purchase or appropriate funds for, and then what is the actual funding that you're going to have to raise in fiscal year 23 through taxes or fundraising or what have you. So that's kind of the general gist of it. And I definitely want to open it up to questions before we get too far along.
I just want to say, I think your examples really show the sort of the finesse and understanding, right, that's gone into this. But I confess that I do need a little bit of orientation into the documents themselves. So I'm going to actually just share my screen a little bit, and I see Marcia nodding, so perhaps others agree too. This FY23 request here, there's numbers. I don't know what the allocations are from just looking at the document itself. So I see low.
Yeah.
How can you help me? Help me or orient me in this document itself.
Okay, definitely. And this is where I apologize. It works better as an Excel spreadsheet than it does. If I was to try and compress this onto one page, no one could read it. It would be such tiny font. So I believe if you scroll
So hey, Fielding,
down the next page,
referencing a printed off document rather than the Excel spreadsheet, so you're not scrolling, I guess.
Do you want to share your screen a little bit with us?
If you can open your actual Excel spreadsheet, then that might be more useful, I think.
Okay.
Can I just ask, is the point here that page 60 should be in front of page 59 and it just reads on like a long sheet?
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I was going to say.
Okay, that makes more sense, because then page 16 you just needed to be 59, and I would have understood that a little bit more.
Right. Yeah, okay. Page 60 would go to the left and page 59 would go to the right, and they kind of work, you can read left to right, what is the project, and then how are we going to fund that in the following fiscal years.
Right,
so again, I apologize, it's a little difficult to read. Unfortunately, I'm working on two different computers, so I don't have this spreadsheet on the computer I am broadcasting you with. I am looking at it on a different one, so I'm unable to share this one specifically.
I'm seeing now that it's okay. So there's administration, town clerk, finance listed. So all the departments are here, and you're essentially tracking the assets through the fiscal years. Is that right? And the appropriations.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Do board members see that, or maybe they always did see that? Okay. All right. Go ahead, Marcia.
So the first thing that jumps out at me is the designation of ARPA funding for something. I didn't think we'd made any decisions about the ARPA funding yet.
We haven't, and I want to highlight that this is, primarily for exemplary purposes. The Tracy Hall renovations do fall under the qualification for ARPA funding. While we have not made that decision, it is not set in stone. None of these officially are. It is just primarily shows you that that could be a funding source as we work towards, what we can use ARPA funds for. That is one that qualifies. And so that decision has not been made, but it would qualify as an ARPA funding project.
And just if I can follow up, what are the colors? Can you explain why the different colors?
The colors, it just try to delineate between different departments. I've also tried to highlight, the green and the red in terms of the lettering specifies a fund appropriation versus an actual capital asset purchase. So in red, you'll see I have that tied to a specific project. So that would be, the records restoration for the town clerk, or the PPE for the fire department. And that's going to have their ranking and their priorities levels in red. And so that's for a specific purchase. The green, I just wanted to delineate between a general fund appropriation ongoing that will go towards capital assets, but is not specific in the sense that it's going to a John Deere grader or a PPE for the fire department. A little bit of that. It was just mainly to kind of keep you, to provide a little bit of a break in terms of all of this data that's on this spreadsheet and helps you kind of delineate.
That's a great question. Can you answer it in the context of DPW or highway a little bit? Because I'm seeing, because you have a tanker truck replacement, right? And then you have green bridge appropriations and paving appropriations. So maybe these examples are maybe illustrative of your point. You make these appropriations to these funds to sort of maintain bridges and paving, which is sort of separate than the...
Yes. So I think Public Works is a great example of this. So we have specific capital assets, whether that be a grader or, specific projects for Beaver Meadow Road that we're looking at. But then you have an event I believe was in 2017 or so. And it results in, culverts being replaced and bridge work that needs to be done and paving and all these things that were kind of, are going to happen at some point, maybe not to that extent of what happened in 2017, but things will fail and will need to be replaced. And so the green is kind of that general fund appropriation that will go towards a capital asset. Specifically, it'll be paving or it'll be a piece of equipment. But you may not know exactly which culvert or which bridge is going to fail. But it allows you to plan ahead for those situations. I wanted to include them. I think you could have a philosophical debate in terms of whether they can live on a capital improvement plan, but I think they go towards capital assets and are used specifically for given, paving is going to happen, in the future. You're not going to get around it. So I think it works to include that and to have your mind understand that it does have a cost. It may not be spent on a specific project that year, but you are going to appropriate funds for future use.
That's great. And I think actually Claudette has raised that philosophical question with us in the past. And so this is, I don't want to speak for Claudette, but I think this is more in line with some of what she's advocated for.
And I would like to say, I think this is kind of the preliminary document. I think as we kind of go through this process through this year and coming budget years, I think a big part of this is we're doing that asset inventory. And this capital improvement plan will grow and to the point where in an ideal, in a perfect world, you will include every single truck of the DPW department and you'll show, okay, this needs to be replaced this year. We should be saving such and such an amount for that replacement over time. And you can see that. So for example, if you look at, the breathing apparatus in the fire department, we show that purchase in fiscal year 23, and then I immediately in the following fiscal years have allocated out, 1/15 of that cost as kind of to start that savings plan again. So in 15 years, you're fully funded, and it's not a big hit to the community in that specific year. And so that's kind of the ultimate goal of this document as we grow into it, is to have every asset, every bridge, every kind of big critical piece of infrastructure or assets, and how we plan to maintain those assets.
That's great. Claudette, thank you for that. Claudette has her hand up. Go ahead, Claudette.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that these are proposed capital improvement plan projects that we as the board actually need to agree with them. There are some there that are listed there that I know there's significant opposition to some of them. So it's just keep that in mind. This is, as Fielding has mentioned, this is not set in stone, and it's something that we would need to agree to as a board.
Yes, thank you, Claudette. And I'm going to that's a good transition, and we could wrap up unless people have some further discussions, because our conversation will continue, in fact. But that was actually the one thing in arriving a little bit earlier that I had mentioned to Rod, like how are we developing a process where the board can now work with these documents. And so I'm going to give that to Rod, and then Mary, your hand up, and I see Andy has a public comment. So can you answer that question a little bit in the spirit of Claudette's comment?
And thanks for the question or comment, Claudette. It's a great point. So what we have attempted to do so far is, in keeping with the calendar that's been laid out for doing the budget for the FY23, is give you information about our current year to date, in particular, closing, where we're at the end of September. Use that to shine a light on our planning processes for the financial year 2023 process, which we're engaged in now. Then go through the operational budget, indicating to you the extent of the work that we've already done, working with department heads and other cost items in the budget, so that we can give you a very initial sense of what the likely increase is going to be with and I want to emphasize this, with a very preliminary number of 2.16. So just hold that in your head now, that right now that's what we think very roughly, but that number it's not likely to change. It will change, and it will probably go up and down before we're done. And then show you the relationship between two key components. That is the way the designated funds are funded year on year, which is through the operational budget, and then how those designated funds translate to the capital improvement plan, and what the kinds of commitments, the long-term commitments we've already made and will be making in the future to expend those funds from the designated funds, and where applicable, using grant monies or other sources to offset those costs for capital items. And so what we're saying now is we've tried to give you kind of a working model of the budget and a working model of how we're going to work forward from now, so that you can get a better sense of where we're at. We don't expect you to agree to all these capital items in the capital improvement plan. We don't expect you to all agree all the time about their ranking or their priority. And we do expect you to look at each one of them and have good questions for us, which may involve us going, offline, as it were, and going back to staff and other places to find out the answers. But in the end, you'll have the confidence by using this process that when you actually package the budget at the end, in the December timeframe, that you'll know what it is that you're suggesting that the voters should vote on. And I hope that this process has been clear enough for you to get a sense of how this is going to work, and just to underscore Claudette's point, that we as staff putting the budget together for you, we are not making value judgments or defending this list, we're explaining how this list came about. And if you want to change it, it's your prerogative as a select board to change it.
That's great. I feel really good about that question and answer. I see people nodding too. Marcia, go ahead. And then actually, Mary, you were first, and then Marcia. I'm sorry, Mary.
First of all, I appreciate the model discussions.
No, Mary.
What is it?
Keep going. We just lost you.
Okay. One thing I find a little procure for bridge replacement, and I assume there are state and maybe federal grants, but I don't understand the timing of those, either of when the bridge needs to be replaced or when the grants are available.
Right.
I can answer that.
So just to restate, because Mary was going in and out, I think Mary was saying, like, how is it that the replacement schedule or the needs of our infrastructure relate to grant funding cycles, and how can that be effectuated in a capital budget plan?
Good question, Mary. So the way it works is that we depend on a bridge and culvert inventory, and that inventory lists the condition. So basically we have condition reports for all these capital items. And so we have a sense of which are the most urgent to replace and which are the least urgent to replace. It changes a little bit, you know, it doesn't take much to change the status of a bridge from one year to the next. Obviously the more heavily traveled roads have the more important bridges and culverts, but you know, a bridge failure or a culvert failure somewhere else obviously gets that replacement further up the list. And so in any one year, the state makes allocations through grant programs that we utilize to offset the cost of replacing the bridges and culverts. And we rank the urgency of the projects or the importance of the projects in conjunction with the state and the Regional Planning Commission, the Two Rivers Attic-PG. And so in that way, we're working in a context where regionally priorities get set, the Regional Planning Commission's role. That's consistent with the state's funding plan for bridge and culvert infrastructure. And then there are annual allocations from them that work through the grant program. So things might jump around a little bit, but basically we're working with a set number of bridges and culverts. We know what condition they're in, and we try and maximize opportunities to ensure that we get the most work done in any one year.
Okay. Great.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to take a public comment, and then oh yes, Marcia, yes, that's right. So I'll take Marcia and then a public comment, and then we must move on because we must move on. Hi, Marcia.
So I really like this, and I hope that we can keep this kind of a format so that we don't have to have a learning curve all the time and see things in different formats. But I would propose calling this something like staff proposed capital budget or capital projects, and then have another document that's the actual or something, so that we can have an ongoing picture, but it's not conflated with what we actually have decided for priorities. I think there should be an accurate record of what we've done each year, but I love this kind of approach of being able to see everything that you have put together that anticipates the needs. And if we have to have it in this sort of fashion, maybe you could keep the numbering that happens automatically in Excel so that we could go from sheet to sheet by numbers, by the lines.
I can do that. And I think it's important to highlight this is a tool that you guys ultimately, as the select board and you know, also the voters, are ultimately making this decision. I think a large part of those singulars that I had kind of went over last meeting, that is the staff's way to kind of propose projects and provide a justification. Those that side of it. That's kind of our attempt to propose those scenarios or bring them, to the forefront. Ultimately, you are the decision makers as to what would make it onto this document, this CIP plan from there.
I just don't want to lose the longevity that we've got here, the long view.
Definitely.
But I also want to keep an accurate record of what we've decided.
Correct. Okay.
Okay, that's great. Go ahead, Andy Shear, would you like to give a public comment?
Yes, thank you. Question and comment, if I may. And I think maybe you've answered this, but you have an identified project. Do you need select board and or voter approval for that project? So let's look at, one of your CIPs at the Elm Street Bridge for $600,000. Is that a select board approval or is it a voter approval? And that's my first question, if I may wait. If I can, is that answerable?
Can you make your comment and then we'll round up the question? Go ahead.
Sure. All right. And my comment in looking at some of the CIPs, there's a $600,000 outlay for Elm Street Bridge road paving, going from gravel to pavement and some of the steeper hills for $250,000. Bridge number 39 on Beaver Meadow Road, $850,000. That's $1.6 million for car infrastructure. And I, appreciate Rod's take on that. And, there's an assessment process that happens. But I just want to say that that's all car infrastructure. There's nothing for biking. There's nothing for walking in that. And I think we owe it to the town, to some of the people to improve other things that are just not car related. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. And then it's an opportunity to answer the clarity of that question. So why don't we answer that? Because Andy's right, we've hit on it. But yes, a specific capital project, how is that approved by the voters through our budget process that we've been discussing this evening? I'll turn it to Rod.
Okay, so thank you, Andy, for the question. In a nutshell, it's the select board's responsibility to present a budget and then to be able to defend and explain the budget. And in doing so, they'll rely on outside experts and justifications, if you like, to defend those budget choices that they've made as they put together the document. The select board is required to give adequate explanation to the voters so that the voters can determine where the money, where their tax dollars are going. And so in your example for the Elm Street Bridge, the select board would need to demonstrate that the Elm Street Bridge urgently needed to be replaced and give a reasonable estimate of what its cost for replacement was and how the select board would propose to use sources of grant funds to offset that cost and ask the voters to vote for a budget with that capital project included. If the voters, as an entity, concluded that they wanted to amend the budget, there's a mechanism for doing that from the floor, through the process of basically warrant articles in the Norwich instance, because in Norwich people vote through the Australian ballot. The so-called Australian ballot, which oddly enough doesn't actually exist, in Australia. So, but that's an aside. So that's the mechanism that townspeople would use, and so you would be proposing an amendment or some such thing to reallocate the funds that were to be dedicated to the capital project that was the rebuilding of the Elm Street Bridge to something else. And so, and I should add that the process that I outlined about how the town works with ranking and identifying the most urgent capital projects was an outline of a process. It wasn't my take, it was an explanation of the mechanism that is employed. And I recognize and acknowledge that it was the example we were using, all these capital expenditures are car-centric, but we are living in the environment that we're in terms of funding structures and obligations for existing road infrastructure, which is dominated by the car in many different ways. And it's not a value judgment on my, I'm not sharing my value judgment here. I'm just explaining the process.
Cool. So yes, go ahead, Claudette, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, just to point out to Andy's my comment earlier about how some of these capital improvement projects have not been decided on by the select board. The hill paving is a perfect example. That's something that was presented by our previous DPW director that we know as a board does not have support of at least a segment in town. But it's also my understanding that because we have a designated fund for bridges, we do not necessarily need voter approval to identify or to, if we as the select board say the Elm Street Bridge project is something that we are going to repair in fiscal year 24. If we've got the designated funds in that, we would need to go to the voters if we required funding like a bond to repair that bridge. But if we have the money in the designated funds, I don't believe we need the voter approval as a board to approve those funds to be used to fix the Elm Street Bridge.
That's correct.
Right. And Rod is nodding. Okay, Marcia, you have a follow-up, but like it's 9:32, so at this point, it's
I'm just looking at the Secretary of State's website with petitions for annual meetings. It's 17 BSA 2642A3A. And if you read that, I think you can figure out what you do. It says you can petition 5% of the voters to ask to have something placed on an annual meeting.
Right, and we talked about this last time. We talked at length about binding versus non-binding, monetary versus non-monetary. So that discussion has been had. But thank you for the citation, right? And the reference where people can look it up. So I'm gonna move us on, if that's okay. And thank you so much for everyone for participating, Fielding and Rod for this. Okay, so the next one is a discussion for Rod, the board group. A board conversation or discussion around the town manager staffing proposals in support of key town functions. So I'm going to turn it over to Rod to outline his memo to us.
Good. Okay, thank you, Roger, and thank you everybody for staying with me. So the first thing to note is that this came about through the very generous offer from the select board to find ways to alleviate the short-term workload as a consequence of both the DPW director retiring and the town manager leaving, and us being in a situation where we're preparing a budget without a full-time town manager and without a full-time DPW director, which is the biggest department in the town. And so following on from recent decisions to find ways of supporting functions in the town manager's office and identifying discrete projects that we could find outside support for, we are offering some further adjustments or changes. The first one in DPW, the administrative assistant, that's kind of moot at this point in light of Masaki Shuet's resignation. I think at this point I'm recommending that we actively pursue finding a replacement for Masaki at halftime and see how that works out. And hopefully we'll also be able to appoint a new DPW director and reconsider the level of support that they're going to need to fulfill that role. So if you've got any questions about that, I'm happy to entertain them now, or we can wait to the end. The next one is, currently, the role of being DPW director is being fulfilled by Neil Rich, a longtime staff member for the town. He's just completed his 39th year working for the town. Neil's been on the crew for all of those 39 years. And for him to engage in substantial amounts of supervision of the rest of the crew and do the other duties that would typically fall to the DPW director means that he can't operate heavy equipment to maintain the town's roads and to prepare for winter. And then when winter does start, he'll be operating one of the plow trucks, probably at night, and not be in an ideal situation to fulfill all the functions of a DPW director, which would include these kinds of meetings as we build the budget, and then more importantly, undertaking the human resource functions of the DPW director, scheduling of staff, and maintaining, doing the asset management and stock control. Right now, most of the human resource functions, staffing questions, and maintaining the budget and asset management is falling to me in my capacity as interim town manager. And so what I'm looking to do here is to retain the services of a consultant in the range of 8 to 10 hours a week to support Neil in the performance of his function of DPW director, and to ensure that our staff are working efficiently and effectively, and that the workplace atmosphere at Public Works is positive and supportive. As I indicated earlier this evening, we are on the edge of making an appointment for a new heavy equipment operator. So that's been a vacant position for some months, and so that will be a huge improvement. But we still need more management horsepower, and that's what the consultant position would help us with. It would also be useful for getting the budget under control and ensuring that the work performance of the crew improves and it stays at a high level, while particularly over winter and in the absence of a full-time director. So that's that one. And then the last one is, as I continue in this role, it's going to become more and more difficult to fulfill the day-to-day tasks of being a zoning administrator, which are, varied and highly variable from week to week, but easily consume, 2 to 3 days a week in just really basic ways. And so the idea here is to retain the services of a part-time zoning administrator. Many towns around the size of Norwich have a full-time planning director and a part-time zoning administrator. There are many people working in Vermont and New Hampshire that work as zoning administrators for multiple towns at once. They're familiar with the regulatory context and the process, and they're good at interacting with the public and attorneys and other land use specialists that are a large part of the work of a zoning administrator. And so I would encourage you to contemplate, short term at least, advertising for and retaining the services of a zoning administrator as in a part-time role. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, let's sort of proceed a little didactically. Does anyone have any questions on the first recommendation, or sort of the revised recommendation? Or can we move straight to number 2, discussing number 2? I'm referring, of course, to the packet on page 62. So why don't we go straight to number 2? So the recommendation is to seek a consultant support for the current acting DPW director until the position is permanently filled. Anybody have any questions or comments on what Rod has outlined for us regarding the recommendation? Go ahead, Mary.
I just think it's sensible to go in this direction.
Right. Okay, Rob, you had your hand up. Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, I think I would agree that we're pretty seriously understaffed in that area and should find some way to give relief. I just wonder from Rod, is that sort of position commonly held part-time DPW director?
There are plenty of people in the field that are retired or in similar circumstances that could possibly be a consultant. It turns out that I understand that a neighboring town's public works director could be available if the select board approves moving ahead with this, and I think that that would be a good solution in this setting.
Any other discussion? Marcia, for number 2?
Yeah, number 2, long-term, the support for the acting DPW director wouldn't be needed because the DPW director would do that himself.
Yes, so to be clear, the short-term consultant is to support Neil Rich until a new DPW director is appointed, and then the work of that consultant would end.
And we wouldn't need it. That was my point. We wouldn't need it because the new director could handle both.
Right. I mean,
What
I'm kind of, yes, exactly.
So, this was slated for discussion, but would board members be comfortable taking an action on this recommendation?
Yes.
Do you want to do them separately?
I do, if that would be okay. Procedurally, I think. So can I take would somebody be willing to make a motion to affirm the recommendation number 2 as outlined in the packet?
So moved.
Okay, made by Rob, seconded by?
A second.
Seconded by Mary. Okay, any further discussion on this? So again, what we're doing is we're affirming our recommendation to seek a consultant support for the current acting DPW director, Neil Rich, until the position of DPW director is filled. That is, go ahead, Marcia.
Just confused about what happened to number 1.
I jumped ahead because I believe there was consensus to do so. So I can go back to 1.
Well, I'd like to treat them all the same. So if we're going to vote individually, maybe vote each one.
Yes, I was doing it in order of polemic, I guess. Go ahead. Go ahead, Claudette.
Could we amend that to X hours per week?
Sure. So there was an amendment to include 8 to 10, approximately 8 to 10 hours per week. Is that okay? Okay. Is there a second to that amendment?
Yes.
Okay, Mary seconded that amendment. Okay. So all in favor. So any further discussion?
Mm-mm.
Okay. So why don't we take a vote on the motion as amended, which was to have a consultant to support the acting DPW director for up to 8 to 10 hours a week. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, thank you. So you have support for that, Ron.
Thank you. That's great.
We'll go back to 1. So number 1, the recommendation was to offer a full-time position to the current part-time DPW administrative assistant to be reviewed at the time of appointing a permanent DPW director. I believe the recommendation that Rod has now offered is to begin to search for a part-time DPW administrative assistant.
Yes, that's correct.
That's the recommendation. And that would be the existing staffing that we have now, basically. Good, Marcia.
By part-time, do you mean like 20 hours, 10 hours? What do you mean?
Masaki was half-time, so 20 hours a week, yes.
Go ahead, Claudette.
Yeah, I just want to point out that right now, there's no change. As everybody has always said, I don't think we need to do anything with number one because we're just continuing on with what the current situation.
That's sort of how I felt, and I jumped ahead.
Exactly.
So
number one is moved.
the recommendation is now so modified as a result of the circumstances that I jumped ahead. That's why I jumped ahead.
Right.
So glad we discussed it and we got the clarity on the number of hours, and it seems like we could say by consensus that we'll assume that will happen.
That one doesn't need a motion.
We don't need to unless
Okay, no, keep
now
going.
what is significant is there's this, or what's different now is there's a third recommendation is to seek a part-time zoning administrator to support the work of the planning director until the position of town manager is permanently filled. So why don't we discuss that one a little bit more? Does anyone have any questions or comments on this third recommendation? Go ahead, Marcia.
Yeah, I just think that there's the potential for conflict with planning and zoning director being one person. And so I think, maybe we should be thinking in long-term having another position that's a zoning administrator.
Okay. Mary, did you have your hand up?
I think in present circumstances, it's just needed for the number of hours that have to be filled, but I think long-term, it should be included as well. Just because I think then the planning director can spend more time on planning. And the zoning administrator, I see it's more of a interpretation and enforcement of the rules, but it's a little bit less, I think, sort of, I don't know, call it visionary, something like that. So
Sure.
I see them as distinct roles.
Okay, Claudette.
Yeah, splitting it, I think, is a discussion for our operating budget. But in the interim, I am in support of Rod's proposition.
Okay, I'm seeing some nods. So again, this recommendation is, seek a part-time as defined. How is it defined, Rod, for us?
It's, I believe it was defined as 2 days per week, so 16 hours a week.
Okay.
Yes.
So it's 6. So the recommendation is seeking a part-time up to 16 hours a week for our zoning administrator to support the work of the planning director until the position of town manager is permanently filled. Is the recommendation?
So moved.
Okay. So Claudette made the motion. Is there a second for that motion?
Second.
Okay, second. Any further discussion? Okay. All in favor, please raise your hand. Okay, unanimous. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Linda Cook, you have a public comment?
Yes, this is Linda Cook. I would like to thank you, Rod, for all of the positions you have been covering and doing very well with it, and all the support that you've gotten from other staff members that have also helped you. Thank you very much on behalf of the town for the work you've done and the way you've presented it to this board and to the public.
Thank you, Linda. That's great.
Yes, absolutely. That was well said. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Do we have number 13 or what are we doing with that?
So we just discussed 13 and we had removed 12 at the start of our agenda.
We discussed 13?
We
just did.
We just did it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at an agenda that has the Kentucky letter.
Oh, this agenda does not. The agenda that's in front of me does not have it. Was that? I think the question is what agenda was warned. Is the agenda that I have the one that was warned?
Yes.
Yes.
27th on the bottom of the second page.
Okay.
And at the top of the first page.
Yes.
Yes. And it's, yeah, we don't have that either. This is, and I just drew this off the website. So yes.
Okay. So so I don't have that here. If perhaps it was probably in an earlier draft and perhaps we could bring forward in the future if needed.
Can we do it next time? Because we said we would do an executive session to talk about that.
Okay, sure, we can discuss in our agenda setting. But
I
the
move
next
to
item,
adjourn.
yeah, I do have.
A second.
Okay.
Call the question.
All in favor, please raise your hand.
Good point.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. All right, good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Record.